All right, so I didn't really want to come and talk about Rails and be all kind of enthusiastic and like preaching a religion. So what I thought I'd do is I thought I'd show you some Rails code and then talk about Ruby and how there's certain things in Ruby that have allowed Rails to be built that way and be really simple. And so that's the plan. And okay, and I should say I have drastically simplified some things here. And if you kind of copied and pasted the code, it might not quite work that way. And if you look at the way the code in Rails is written, you'll find there's a few more edge cases than I've alluded to. But I'm trying to get across the principles of how Ruby's enabled some of those things in Rails. Nope, don't want to do that. Okay. Right, so Ruby is a dynamic scripting language. I'd say it's elegant. I think it's very, very readable. I think when you write good Ruby code, it's like reading English. And it's supposed to have the principle of least surprise, which is that when you do something, it kind of, oh yeah, that works, yeah, of course. You know, it's not like I wrote some code and then it didn't work. It's usually you write some code and find it does work, and it's a pleasant surprise. What I find really interesting is that Ruby is 21 years old. It's actually older than Java. And like for a lot of people, like, they haven't used Ruby and they've probably only just heard about it or only heard about it within the last few years. But it's actually older than Java, which as a 12-year-old veteran of Java, it's quite interesting that I could have been doing Ruby instead of Java code in '98. So the guy who invented Ruby is Mats, and because I'm going to call him Mats because I can't pronounce his actual name. And he said Ruby is designed to make programmers happy. And from my experience, you know, I'm certainly a lot happier now than I was writing Java code. So this is what, I'm going to walk around. So that's what Ruby looks like. And I think 3 times 2 print Ruby is easy. Well, right. We kind of know what that's going to do. We mostly don't need brackets. We don't need semicolons at the end of our lines. Everything is an object. So this number 3 is an object. And we call a method times on that object. And yeah, like we don't need to declare variable types and declare variables before we use them and that sort of stuff. So Rails, in case you haven't heard, it's Ruby on Rails. It's a web framework. It's built in Ruby. It's actually 10 years old, so it's no longer the new hotness. Thankfully, Node.js is the new hotness, and they get to take all the controversy, and Rails can just get on with doing some pretty good work. It's based on, well, there's a few things that sort of principles that Rails has, but one of them is convention over configuration. So if we have a class called user, which is our model, then we can assume that there's going to be a table called users, and we don't have to specify that mapping like we might have done in a lot of web frameworks. So I'm just going to grab some water. Right. And don't repeat yourself, which is, if I remember some of my Java frameworks, you ended up kind of copying and pasting more or less the same code in different places, and the same, referencing the same package and classes in various XML files. So Mats also said that Rails is the killer app for Ruby. And it's quite noticeable that Ruby was just trundling along as a little sysadmin language, and then Rails came along, and all of a sudden we've got a big usage in Rails, more Rails programmers, more demand for Ruby programmers, and so on. And then it's branched out, and you can use Ruby obviously for all the sysadmin automation stuff. You can use it for DevOps type stuff. You can use it for sort of telephony and so on. So Rails is an MVC framework, model view controller. I'm not going to explain what that is, but that's what it looks like. So in this case, we've got a model user. It's representing a row in the database. User has many projects, and we just validate that there is a field called username and email. Right. I haven't actually missed out any code there. That's the code you would need to define a user that has many projects. And so we can do things with that model. We can create a new user. We can give it an email address. We can save it. That will save it to the database. And we can also find the user by the username. So, like a few of you might be looking at this going, yeah, my framework can do that as well. But your 10-year-old framework couldn't do that, and more than likely, it's been inspired by Rails. Certainly, I've seen some Laravel code, and I knew instantly what was going on because I could just read it like Ruby. So views, we've got a bunch of HTML and some ugly tags, and in the middle of that, we can put some Ruby code. Fairly kind of standard sort of templating thing. I won't talk about views too much, and I'm not going to talk about how you include HTML, bits of HTML within blocks of Ruby. Right, and the controller is usually that meat of the application that ties together, you know, the incoming request and does some work and spits out the view. So in this case, show, and I haven't shown the router, which would map the URL to this. You know, we're going to find a user by their username. We're going to take the parameter, and that's it. That's all we need to do. So I've flown through the Rails code because it's not. We want to talk about the Ruby. So I'm going to go back and just revisit one or two lines from that. First thing is really simple, symbols. We use them all over the place. So a symbol is anything that has a colon in front of it. And you can just think of them as static strings or constants. And what it means is, you know, we could actually use a string in place. You can see at the bottom. I'm actually using strings here. And you could use strings, but you're then declaring a new string each time. Whereas with symbols, you're not. So it saves on memory. It looks a bit cleaner. And there's also, you know, there's no confusion about equality testing. There's no, is this the same instance of that string, or is it the same, you know, characters within that string? So we use symbols pretty much everywhere in Ruby code. We use them like HasMini projects. We're passing the symbol projects into that method, where we can use it in hashes, like a dictionary, so key, value, and yeah, they're pretty much used just all over the place. But it's just a nice little syntax. So another thing, hashes, dictionaries, whatever you want to call them, hash maps, curly brace, and this thing, which is called a hash rocket. So we're you can kind of see why. So you know, key, value. It you know, again, I think you can look at it and go, oh yeah, I understand what that is. We can retrieve the value. We can set the value. And the alternate syntax for that, which it came in 1.9, is actually to take the colon from the start and put it at the end, and then you can lose the equals and greater than. All right. But hashes on their own, you know, most languages have them. Certainly most dynamic languages. But what's really nice with Ruby is we can actually drop the curly braces, and if we pass something that looks like a hash that has these key value pairs, if we pass that as the last argument to a method, then we don't actually need to declare the curly braces. And what that means is we can do something that looks a little bit like named parameters for methods. So we don't have to rely on passing in username as the first argument and email as the second. We can actually name them in our code, and again, that makes it a lot more readable. because you don't have to understand the method ordering of that particular method if it uses a hash in this way. Right, what else did I write? Yeah, so that is just equivalent to actually declaring the hash and passing it in as an argument. All right, so this is where things get, I think this is a really nice thing about Rails, the nice thing it does, right? In our controller, we were looking for a user, and we did user.findByUsername. But in our user class, we haven't declared findByUsername. And if you search the source code, you won't find findByUsername. And if you looked at the runtime, you won't find findByUsername. So in most languages, if you try and call a method that doesn't exist, either the compiler just turns and goes, you know, you're being ridiculous, what are you doing? Or it blows up. But what Ruby does is go, oh, you're trying to call a method that doesn't exist. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this other method called method missing, and I'm going to pass in the name of the method that you were trying to call and the arguments you were trying to call it with. And because it's a method, and because it exists in basic object up the hierarchy, you can override it. So some of you might see where this is going. We can implement our own method missing method, and we can use a regular expression to parse that method that you were trying to call, right? So we can take find by and blah, whatever, and we can construct an SQL statement, and we can do whatever we want with it, right? So now I can call user.findByUsername, and it will generate some SQL that looks for username equals Jamie. So it's taken the arguments that we passed in, it's taken the column name, which is parsed out of the method name that we were trying to call, and it generates some SQL. Now, that's massively simplified, but you can see where where Rails gets some of that power, because we don't have to write this code, we don't have to manage it, we don't have to document it, we don't even have to find it, we just have to make that call. And equally well, I can call, find by banana, and it will try and find by the banana column in the users table, which obviously doesn't exist. So I guess that's a bit of a downside, and sometimes you're trying to figure out. Certainly when I started using Rails, I was like, where is this method? I want to look at what it's doing. I want to look at the arguments for it, and it doesn't exist. So right at the start, we did a block, and a block is just anything between do and end in this case, and a block is some code that we can pass around, and it doesn't get executed until we want to. So in this case, we're not printing Ruby in this context. We're actually passing the block do end print Ruby into the method times. And I don't know, if you were doing this in Java, you'd have anonymous classes and interfaces and so on, and you'd pass that around. You pass this instance of an anonymous class, and you'd call a run method or something. But we don't need to do that. We can just pass around that block of code as a parameter. And we used it here. So user projects each, and what it's going to do is going to iterate through all of the users' projects, and it's going to call this block of code with the project. And if you're still with me, you can actually implement something like the times method on a number. So we have our CorkDev number class. Initialize is just our constructor where you pass in a number. We store it in an instance variable called value. And we define our method times, and that takes a block. So what it does, just takes a block of code. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to for loop, and you almost never see them in Ruby because we typically use blocks and each and that sort of stuff. So for I in 1, 2, so this just generates a range of numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and we'll iterate over that, and we're just going to call yield, and yield takes the block. If a block is passed in, yield will call it, and it will call it within that context, so it's going to call it 4 times. And so this is how we'd actually use that. CorkDev number new 4 times print Ruby. I just find some of this stuff quite interesting because it's these little features that let us make Rails quite easy to understand and easy to write. So I think this is the last one. We had user.projects, and in our user class we did declare HasMini projects, but nowhere do we have a method that's projects for actually retrieving them. And it doesn't work in the same way that our find by username works. So it doesn't work by using method missing. What actually happens is HasMini is a class level method in activerecord, and it creates a whole bunch of new methods in our current class for us. So there's an example of them here, and it does that based on the parameter we've passed in. So when we say HasMini projects, it goes, ah, right, you've got many projects. You're going to need a projects method to retrieve them. You're going to need a way of assigning all those projects. You're going to need a way of adding a project to that list of projects. And it generates like 16 odd methods for us, all from calling HasMini projects. And again, we can do something like what Rails is doing. And we can say Jamie HasMini things. Things is our variable. In this case, we might say cameras, because I do. And what we're going to do is we're going to just define a method, things.toString. So convert this argument to a string, and that's going to be our method name. And what it's going to do is the stuff in this block, which is just return the instance variable things. And here we're just setting the value of the instance variable things. That's what, so if we passed in HasMini cameras, then the method that we're going to create automatically will be cameras equal, and that gets called when we that gets called when we call Jamie, an instance of Jamie, Jamie.cameras equals. So that's kind of really confusing. I hope you're thoroughly confused, because I probably haven't done my job otherwise. And this, again, Matt, I thought it was a really good quote, actually. Ruby's simple. And when I started learning Rails, everything was really simple because you don't have to write much code. But when you need to try and understand what Rails is doing, then you go, oh Christ, what's that? I don't understand it. And so, yeah, I think the same can be said of Rails, that it's actually very simple when you write it, and it's very hard and complicated underneath the surface. So that's it.
Thanks, Jamie. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, no, can you handle threads in Ruby?
Can you do threads in Ruby? Yes, you can. Ruby has some excellent threading libraries. Yeah. The problem is in the implementation. So the actual the implementation of Ruby that's mostly used is MRI, and that has something called a global interpreter lock, which mostly means that in most cases only one thread can run at the same time. But there's something called JRuby, which runs Ruby inside the JVM, and then you've got access to all the sort of threading goodness of the JVM. So actually Ruby is really nice for writing threads. They just don't perform the way you'd like. Yeah?
I didn't see any comparison like if case and that kind of stuff.
Purely because I didn't put it in. But yeah, I mean, obviously, like Ruby has if statements, has case statements, but in general, you'd probably avoid doing them because you'd try and treat objects. Well, I don't want to say it. You know, it has what you'd call duck typing. So if it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, then you treat it like a duck. So you're not going to do like switch statements based on the class name and that sort of stuff. You're generally going to assume that if you have this class, and I don't know what it would be doing. You know, if you have some actor class that's been passed into your method, you're going to assume that if you call dot whatever, you know, whatever you're expecting that class to do, that it's going to work. And if it's not working, then that's a sort of testing problem, right? So in general, you're not going down switching on, you know, is this a certain type of class? Is it a string? Is it a number? You just call like dot string and assume that whatever is passed in is going to be is going to have that method. Is that the kind of context you were thinking of? No?
Not quite. It was about getting information from a source and compare it with something known, or compare it with something from another source, and with that give another information. If I have A and B, then I have C, S, I have D. Construction like that.
Yeah, okay, so you can do that.
Good old if then else.
Yeah, I mean, it if else, you know, it kind of looks like pretty much every other if else statement in programming languages. We also have case statements. You know, in Java, I think it's switch and case, but in Ruby, the switch is called case, and then we have case when. Just to confuse people. But there are those sort of control flows. What's mostly not used are loops. You generally don't do for loops or while loops because you use iterators the majority of the time, except when they're not available. But if statements, switch statements, they're there.
I didn't see any pointers either.
Nope. Nope, because this is a nice high-level language, and we don't have to worry about rubbish like memory and shit like that. And this is perfect for me because that's why I started doing Java in '98, because I don't want to deal with that shit because I've got better things to be doing. Which means that I don't work on like network protocol drivers or hardware interfaces, but it means I get to work on things like intelligent agents and web applications and shit like that. So.
And the last one, callback functions. And functions are as arguments.
Yeah, so you can, I'm not going to even try and explain the difference between procs and blocks and whatever the other one is, lambdas, but they have, there are constructs that let us do that. The majority of the time we're probably using blocks where you would use, where you would pass in functions. Say in JavaScript, where you would pass in a function, would pass in a block. But there are some other constructs as well. And I don't want to even think about the differences because they're minor, but does that explain it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd like to know what is active record exactly? It's because I think I've seen people using it on PHP or something like that.
There might be some PHP equivalent of active record. Active record, first of all, is a pattern. It's a design pattern, but it's also the name of the library within Rails that provides us with an ORM to sit on top of our database. So it maps our classes to our tables, our instances to our rows. It's what.
So it's kind of the repository pattern.
I don't know. It's what it is really is you can think of well, the pattern is managing individual rows out of a database. Mm-hmm. You know, so an instance of a class is one row in that database. Fields of that instance are database columns or database fields. And so that's what ActiveRecord gives us. That gives us that searching. It gives us the ability to save an object, and it understands the attributes of that object need to be mapped into the columns of that database. And convention over configuration, we don't actually manually do the mapping. We can, but it assumes that if you've got a user that has a username, that it's going to find a column called username in the users table.
Actually, I just have a question. As an ex-Java developer, were you tempted to go the Groovy and Grails route?
Not at all.
I'm just
No.
wondering.
No, not for one bit. And I think, look, when it came to actually, I wanted to learn something new. This was, I don't know, 6 years ago. I wanted to learn something new, and I wanted to do something where I could actually build web applications. I could have built them in Java, but the deployment story for Java web applications was kind of shoot yourself in the head and hope for the best. So Grails would have kind of left me in, or Groovy and Grails would have left me more or less in that same space. So my choice at the time was Python and Django, and I already knew Python, or learn Ruby and Rails. And the decision at the time was Rails had a much bigger and richer ecosystem, much bigger community, lots of very helpful people, and Django didn't. So even though I knew the language, I felt learning that new framework was going to be harder. So I learned a whole new language and a framework. Although, as I kind of alluded to, what I was doing was learning Rails and not really understanding the Ruby behind it, and that's come later. So it came down to community, and that would have been a reason why I wouldn't have gone with like Grails or something.
And what kind of hosting services would you recommend for apps?
The absolute simplest is Heroku. Just you can get you can deploy it for free, and they'll shut down your app if it doesn't get any requests for 30 minutes or something, and bring it back up when the next request comes. But it's great for just getting an application out there. It's pretty much a git push, and it sucks it in, sort of builds this slug, this package, and then runs it. And yeah, Heroku is brilliant. I run all my stuff on VPSs at the moment, but I wouldn't really recommend it because it takes a lot of configuration and sysadmin type work, and we have to do it for like data protection issues. Otherwise, I wouldn't.
And by the way, for the host about Ruby, you can try the IBM Bluemix. It just went online last month, and you still have a free trial. It gives you like 29 days free trial. And just for simple click, you can create a Ruby applications with IBM service integrated inside. So it's really good for starters.
Yeah, I think it works in a fairly similar way to Heroku. And you've got add-ons and stuff.
They just switched to IBM backend. So
Okay.
actually, Heroku is using the IBM Bluemix support.
Okay.
And architecture.
Why didn't you stick with Python?
Like just in it was literally just going to be easier I felt at the time easier to learn Ruby and Rails than to learn Django at the time, and I think Django perhaps, I don't know if it was as mature, maybe it was at the time, but it didn't appear as mature as Rails at the time. Yeah, I think the only thing I've written in Python recently was like Sublime text plugin type thing.
Thanks, Jamie.